Hello, my name is Nathan Brummel, and I hope you're having a great day. Today I want to talk to you about why Charles Spurgeon didn't preach with an iPad. In the series of talks, I am giving a prophetic word, a prophetic talk about preaching, and especially about the act of preaching. Why is it that Charles Spurgeon didn't preach with an iPad? Well, one reason is that he said things like this. He said, to preach the gospel is not to mumble over some dry manuscript. It is not to speak colorlessly about color or odorlessly about odor. Charles Spurgeon did not preach with an iPad. He didn't. And he wouldn't have. Yes, I know you're saying they weren't around back in his day. That's true. He lived in 19th century Victorian England. And no iPads had been invented yet. But even as a young preacher in his late teens or in his potentially hip early 20s, Spurgeon never preached with an iPad. Today it is cool for hip preachers to walk around on the stage with their iPad in hand. The use of an iPad is a sign of coolness in comparison to the old fuddy-duddy preachers who use paper. Using an iPad is actually inferior to the use of paper. I will reject the idea of a preacher writing out his sermon in essay form in order to read it in the pulpit. The difficulty with an iPad is that the screen is smaller than the normal size page of paper. Therefore, the preacher with a page of paper in front of him has more room to put material and more to see than occurs on an iPad screen. If the minister is going to use paper in the pulpit, he should use an outline at which he only needs to glance. You're going to see that the word glance is kind of an important word to me. Now, it simply is a myth that Spurgeon would have ever preached with an iPad. It would have been ahistorical. It never would have happened. And the reason why it would have never happened is that the prince of preachers didn't use paper either, or much of paper. Now, the prince of preachers would not have used an iPad. Now, it's a little dangerous language, isn't it, to refer to the great London Calvinist as a prince of preachers when, of course, our master came preaching. But the prince of preachers did not allow paper to become between his eyes and the congregation. At times, it's true that Spurgeon did take a very, very brief outline into the sermon, into the pulpit. But it was brief, and he did not depend upon it. Now, Charles Spurgeon didn't allow paper or an iPad to come between his eyes and the congregation in the act of preaching, and that is my concern. My concern is that in the act of preaching, too many preachers or seminary students allow their paper or their iPad to come between them and the congregations. You might as well take your paper and hold it up in front of your face so that you can't see the congregation, because the reality is that every time you're looking down at your paper, you're not looking at the congregation. Now, how do we know that Spurgeon would not have preached from an iPad? Well, he didn't allow the technology of his day, namely a paper manuscript, to become a barrier between him and his audience. Spurgeon would not allow paper or an iPad to come between him and his audience because he believed in gaining and keeping the attention of his audience. Sometimes I wonder if this is a lost art. I know that in the Reformed and Presbyterian churches, people have grown up all their life sometimes in the church, and therefore they have very good customs of listening to sermons. They've learned that it takes work, and I'm astonished with what they put up with. I'm astonished with how there can be preachers who read their sermons for years, and the entire time they're reading their sermons, they're not even looking at the congregation. They're looking at the side walls, and then the back wall, and then that side wall, and then they start over again, never even looking at the congregation. And even lacking a sense that what they need to do is grab the attention of the congregation, and then keep it. Spurgeon also didn't hide behind a pulpit as he preached. Sometimes I am a little concerned about the fact that we have these massive pulpits that are in front of the preachers. Spurgeon didn't hide or stay behind a pulpit so that he could glance down to read a manuscript in which he had written out his sermon in great detail to make sure he got every single sentence and word right. The Metropolitan Tabernacle was built with a balcony for the preacher. And so Spurgeon was free to walk around as he preached from the heart. In his lectures to my students, which are, of course, a wonderful read, and every preacher better have read that, if not in seminary later on, he includes a chapter entitled, "Attention!" He admits that an overlooked topic in homiletics is how to obtain and retain the attention of our hearers. And really, this is why I have such a passion for extempore approaches to preaching. Spurgeon said that the preacher needs the earnest, candid, wakeful, continued attention of all those who are in the congregation. Now, let that sink home. I often will be sitting in a church where a preacher is going on and on. He has lost the attention of the congregation, and he doesn't even know it. He is absolutely clueless. And so he just continues to read his manuscript in an unemotional way. And he doesn't even know, he doesn't even realize that what he needs to be doing is winning back the attention of the congregation. Spurgeon is true when he writes things like, "There are preachers who care very little whether they are attended to or not. So long as they can hold on through the allotted time, it is of very small importance to them whether their people hear for eternity or hear in vain." I don't know if ministers just think that somehow it's inappropriate to demand the attention of the congregation. But don't you think that God's prophets in the Old Testament demanded the attention of God's congregation? Don't you think that Christ, when he preached, also demanded and expected that people would hang on to his words and believe them? In his inimitable style, Spurgeon says of such preachers, now I realize this is strong language, but he says, "The sooner such ministers sleep in the churchyard and preach by the verse on their gravestones, the better." Spurgeon advises the preacher to gain the attention of the congregation by always saying, he says, "something worth hearing." Now, this past Sunday I preached, and as I preached the sermon, I realized that some people in the congregation might not think that some of the ideas and concepts and teaching of Paul in his closing doxology in the Epistle to the Romans might be relevant for their life. So I realized part of my job was to show them that what Paul was saying was worth their hearing. A minister can also lose the attention of his auditors by verboseness. Charles Spurgeon says, "It is not a severe criticism to say that there are ministers whose words stand in a very large proportion to their thoughts." What is going on when your words stand in very large proportions to your thoughts? Well, what's going on is that you have a lot to say, and you haven't studied the text in detail. And you don't understand what is truly vital and what ought to grip your heart and the heart of your hearers. And so you go on with lots of unimportant stuff. Charles Spurgeon was also concerned with something that I will deal with later on, which is order and logic in the sermon. Spurgeon said, "Let the good matter which you give them be very clearly arranged." Notice that he says, let it be very clearly arranged. Spurgeon exhorted, "Put the truth before men in a logical, orderly manner so that they can easily remember it and they will the more readily receive it." I find that people are biased against order. They're biased against order in organizations, they're biased against organizations, and they're biased against order and logic in sermons. And I suppose that's because of the context we're in. If you go and listen to some, for example, messages by men or women who are running for president, running for political office, their messages are often very illogical. There's no unity to their messages. There's no clear, simple, main point being made, and people are just imitating what they find in political speeches. Isn't that wonderful? Preachers who are imitating politicians. But what catches our attention at the beginning of this series of lectures and talks, prophetic talks on the act of preaching, is what Spurgeon says about how one's manner of address can lead to either losing or catching the attention of the congregation. The Prince of Preachers tells the preacher, "Do not read your sermon." And so it blows my mind when preachers get up and they haven't even memorized, or better yet, internalized their introduction. Apparently what they've been studying all week long wasn't even important enough to seize their mind so that they can simply look into the eyes of the congregation and show the congregation the important issues here, their excitement about it. And so they begin the sermon, sometimes in very boring ways, or through the same way they've begun all of their other sermons, and they put their eyes on their manuscript and they read. They read their sermons. They read their introduction. No, if you want to gain and keep the attention of the congregation, do not read your sermon word for word off paper or an iPad. Charles Spurgeon says, "Attend also to your manner of address. Aim in that at the promotion of attention." And here I should say, as a rule, do not read your sermons. Spurgeon says there have been a few readers who've exercised great power, and he gives Dr. Chalmers as an example. He says that this Dr. Chalmers could not have had a more attentive audience had he been extemporizing. But then, Spurgeon says, I do not suppose that we are the equal to Dr. Chalmers. Men of such eminence may read if they prefer it, but for us there is a more excellent way. Now, I know that there are ministers out there who can read their sermons word for word in a way that makes it sound as if they are preaching extemporaneously. And so that their preaching actually comes across as lively, with their emotions involved. But even if you take that kind of preaching and put it next door, put it right next to someone who is actually preaching extemporaneously, the former preacher will sound much drier. Spurgeon says, "The best reading I have ever heard has tasted of paper and has stuck in my throat." Spurgeon says, "I have not relished it, for my digestion is not good enough to dissolve foolscap. It is better to do without the manuscript, even if you are driven to recite. It is best of all if you need neither to recite nor to read." There he's talking about just memorizing your sermon. Now, I remember, for example, a student in seminary, and instead of internalizing the message, he memorized his manuscript word for word. And the problem about that is that when you get up there and now you're searching and you're trying to remember the exact words in your manuscript, your eyes at times will roll back in your head. But Spurgeon says, if you must read, mind that you do it to perfection. Be the very best of readers. And you would need to be if you would secure attention. Now, Spurgeon immediately clarifies that he is not recommending radically extemporaneous approaches to preaching, or what we would call impromptu speeches. There's a big difference between what we in homiletics, what I in homiletics call impromptu speaking, and extemporaneous preaching. Impromptu preaching is when you basically don't do any preparation. It's like one time I went to, as a seminary student, went to catechism classes. I had to go and visit catechism classes of an experienced minister to see how we taught catechism to the children. And when I showed up, it was funny how suddenly his face turned pink and he became embarrassed because he had been busy out on pastoral calls and had been unable to prepare for the catechism lessons, and he had to teach some Bible stories. But what happened there is that this minister had taught those Bible stories many times before in his life. And therefore, he, in an impromptu way, taught the stories to the children, and he actually did a great job. But see, there had been no preparation for that. But even in that case, you realize that that minister, of course, was not totally impromptu, because he was drawing off the fact that he had prepared messages and talked about these Bible stories many times in the past. So in a certain sense, they were extemporaneous in the right sort of way because he had prepared for giving these talks and these messages in the past years. Spurgeon says this. He says, "Here, let me say, if you would be listened to, do not extemporize in the emphatic sense, for that is as bad as reading, or perhaps worse, unless the manuscript was written extemporaneously. I mean, without previous study." He says, "Do not go into the pulpit and say the first thing that comes to hand, for the uppermost thing with most men is mere froth. Your people need discourses which have been prayed over and laboriously prepared. People do not want raw food," Spurgeon says. He says it must be cooked and made ready for them. Yes, that's true. Spurgeon is right. It needs to be cooked and made ready in your heart and in your soul. Spurgeon then tells us what his preferred manner of address is. The Prince of Preachers says, "The best method is, in my judgment, that in which the man does not extemporize the matter, but extemporizes the words. The language comes to him at the moment, but the theme has been well thought out, and like a master in Israel, he speaks of that which he knows and testifies of what he has seen." Now, Spurgeon, you see, did not engage in impromptu preaching. Now, it is true, and we will look at his approach to preparation for sermons. And it rested on his reading of the scriptures throughout the week. It rested upon his praying. It rested upon his reading of theology and the Puritans. And too, for most of us ministers, we couldn't do what Spurgeon did. And of course, this also points to a weakness in Spurgeon's sermons, his lack of careful exegesis as a rule. But you see, Spurgeon, though, on Saturdays, did in fact study the text. His wife would help him. He would even have later on seminary students who would be present, finding commentaries, looking at commentaries, and they would read to him from the commentaries what they said on the text. So Spurgeon, the night before, did begin to prepare his sermons. And he did hard work. It was hard work. Sometimes this was stressful for him on Saturday nights, as he selected a text, and his wife, other people helped him dig into the text. And so he began to mold it over in preparation for preaching the next day. Now, when I was a young pastor, I got a hold of a CD that had all of Spurgeon's sermons on it. And so sometimes I would look up the text. There was a catalog. You could look up the text and find where Spurgeon had preached on it. So there might be a text, and you might find that over his many, many decades of preaching, he had preached a couple times on the text. So then what I would do is I would print out Spurgeon's sermon and take a look at them. And of course, there's lots of good stuff there too. But you would also find a lack of careful exegesis of the text, often a lack of interaction with the Hebrew or the Greek text in a way that really, really dug into the text. But at the same time, of course, Spurgeon had marvelous gifts, marvelous gifts of really presenting all kinds of sparkling diamonds of thought, and also a tremendous gift of speaking in parables in a certain sense, an ability to develop concepts, rich imagery that might not even be in the text. But Spurgeon, you see, supported extemporaneous preaching, not impromptu preaching. He wants you to go in the pulpit with the ideas, with the insights into the text, and with the theme of the text, but having freedom in the act of preaching, of using your own language, and even having new insights. And so Spurgeon wanted the minister to study the text, to learn from commentaries, and then to preach the message to his own heart and soul, to prepare an outline of the main points of the sermon. But once he stands in the pulpit, Spurgeon thinks that the minister should extemporize with the words. And I think Spurgeon is absolutely correct here. Spurgeon internalized the message, and with a marvelous extemporaneous ability, he developed and even would craft his sermon in the act of preaching. He once said that as he preached, his mind was so inventive, creative, and pregnant with ideas that he had 7 ideas presented to his mind simultaneously for selection. Now that is a pregnant mind. He always had many different ideas of what he could say next. And then God gave him such a good mind that he could select from these options the most fitting ideas or the most powerful way of saying things. His marvelous artistry with the Bible message was both his strength and his weakness. With his heart steeped in the Bible, his mind suffused with Calvinistic soteriology, and his marvelous poetic and linguistic gifts, he was able to present profound truths with marvelous imagery and symbolism. And so his sermons are filled with imagery and examples that communicate the gospel truth like the light blazes in a multifaceted gem. But his weakness was that he had such facility in extemporaneous preaching that he did not always find the need to do careful exegesis of the biblical text and to actually develop the concepts in the text and keep his nose in the text. That's why, as a young preacher, I found I could get marvelous quotes from Spurgeon, but it was often rare to find good, careful, exegetical insights from his sermons. So in this respect, Spurgeon is not always an example to the present preacher. But Spurgeon emphasized the importance of catching the attention of the congregation. That is evident in his attack on a monotone voice in preaching. What happens, though, when you read a sermon? What happens when I read anything? Well, the danger is that when I read something, I begin to use a monotone voice. Now, isn't it astonishing that ministers can read their sermons in a monotone voice and think that they're engaging properly in the act of preaching? And they're not even reading well. Go and listen to, some type of high-fluting author who's given a reading somewhere, like at, Baker Bookstore in Grand Rapids, Michigan, or at a Barnes & Noble someplace. And what will you notice? Well, there are some writers, some authors who really know how to read well. They know that the way in which they're going to communicate what they wrote is by reading their story well. And what a difference there is. That's why I think, too, when it comes to reading the Bible in public worship, don't read it with a monotone tone. No, read it in a lively way. Read it in a way that expresses the actual text, that communicates the excitement, the wonder, the drama of the actual text. Your voice is important, preacher. Seminary students, you don't seem to always perceive this. Now, I have black students in prison seminaries, and they come from a culture where the voice is a very, very important instrument in preaching. Others, though, don't seem to perceive that. Some Hispanic students perceive the important role of really liveliness and passion in preaching. I'm always struck by how some Hispanic preachers, they bring sort of the emotion and the heart that you find in Hispanic culture into the pulpit. And that is exactly what they should do. Some white students don't seem to perceive the importance of drama in preaching, the importance of catching and maintaining the attention of the congregation. They don't seem to understand the role that your voice needs to play in the act of preaching. Now that's why, too, as a preacher, notice what I'm using here as a microphone. What I have here is a Neumann microphone. This is the famous Neumann U87 microphone. Now, why would I, as a preacher, have a microphone like this? This microphone is famous. It's used in recording studios around the world now for decades. Why would I want to have a microphone like this? Well, it's because, as a preacher, I know the role that my voice plays. Spurgeon's voice played a crucial role in his ability to communicate. Think of someone like George Whitefield. His voice, once again, played a very, very important role in him being able to trumpet the gospel and then sometimes even in a rather quiet way speak and yet be heard by thousands of people at the same time without any microphones, of course, or any speaker systems. So, young man, seminary student, do you understand how you need to develop your voice? Later on, we're going to listen to what a great Presbyterian theologian named Dabney has to say about your voice and the development of your voice. But one problem I have observed with seminary students who read their sermons is that invariably their voice is reduced to a monotone. And connected to that is a lack of living passion. So don't indulge in monotones. You need to vary your voice continually. Yes, I know there are some ministers who have an astonishing lack in this respect. I think of a minister who every sermon he preaches is monotone. His speed of delivery is the same. The tone of his voice remains the same the entire time. And it is no wonder that ministers like that have a difficulty in having a long pastorate in a congregation, because the saints become dull and sleepy. And then don't blame the congregation. No, you need to vary things as you deliver your messages. See, the danger is if you're reading something and you're not reading well. Now, once again, if you're reading like a good author can read her writings very well, she will know when there needs to be a speeding up. She'll know how loud something should be said or how quiet or the sort of emotions that should be expressed. But you need to vary your speed as well. You need to dash as rapidly as a lightning flash sometimes. Spurgeon said other times you need to travel forward in quiet majesty. You need to shift your accent. Spurgeon says you need to vary the tone, use the bass sometimes, go way down low. One problem with some ministers is that they have a very high voice. And in fact, if they speak with that high voice too often, there's something that it's not quite like, scratching a blackboard with your fingertips, with your I can't even think of the word. This is the danger, of course, of extemporaneous preachers, with your fingernails. See, that's the danger of extemporaneous preaching too, is that in the act of preaching, the word you want right there doesn't come. But maybe you'll find it, like I did. So it's not as bad as scratching your fingers on a chalkboard. But if you speak with a high voice, and then when you get excited, your voice gets even higher yet, that grates on the congregation. Now, they might get used to it, but no, instead, bring your voice low at times. And Spurgeon said at times, let the thunders roll within. At other times, speak as you ought to do from the lips. And then he says, just be conversational. Spurgeon was into that. He was into a variety of approaches. There's time to be just down to earth. Spurgeon says, anything for a change.